بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم.
كافها يا عين صاد ذكر رحمة ربك عبده زكريا إذ نادى ربه نداء خفيا قال رب إني وهن العظم مني واشتعل الرأس شيبا ولم أكن بدعائك رب شقيا وإني خفت الموالي من ورائي وكانت امرأتي عاقرا فهب لي من لدنك وليا يرثني ويرث من آل يعقوب واجعله رب رضيا إنا نبشرك بغلام اسمه يحيى لم نجعل له من قال رب أنى يكون لي غلام وكانت امرأتي عاقرا وقد بلغت من الكبر عتيا قال كذلك قال ربك هو علي هين وقد خلقتك من قبل ولم تك شيئا قال رب اجعل لي آية قال آيتك ألا تكلم الناس 3 ليال سويا فخرج على قومه من المحراب فأوحى إليهم أن سبحوا بكرة وعشيا يا يحيى خذ الكتاب بقوة وآتيناه الحكم صبيا وحنانا من لدنا وزكاة وكان تقيا وبرا بوالديه ولم يكن جبارا عصيا وسلام عليه يوم ولد ويوم يموت ويوم يبعث حيا واذكر في الكتاب مريم إذ
Well, there's more of you if you change your mind. You come up and get some if you want. Do not eat the tin foil, that will not be good for you.
فأرسلنا إليها روحنا فتمثل لها بشرا سويا قالت إني أعوذ بالرحمن منك إن كنت تقيا قال إنما أنا رسول ربك لأهب لك غلاما زكيا قالت أنى يكون
I don't think so, but Miss Cortazar. Miss Cortazar, are you here? Apparently not. Miss Dunstan. Miss Dunstan. That's Miss Dunn. Okay, yeah. You come early. Miss. No. Is that behind her? Okay. Okay, Miss Fusco. Miss Gartner. Okay, Miss Gartner. Okay, yeah. Ms. Kisner, no. Ms. Kratz. Ms. Kratz. Ms. Peralta. Ms. Leonard. I thought I saw Ms. Leonard. There she is. There she is. Margalis. No. Margalis. Usually up front, but I don't see her. Ms. Morgan. Ms. Bell. Paniagua. Ms. Rentschler. No. Ms. Raya. Yes. Ms. Swartztrauber. Ms. Shaw. Slacktish, Mr. Decker, Mr. Marino. I'm already losing. What did I do? I gave out chocolate. I hope you all had a good holiday. Today we are going to talk about the message. We've been talking about the messenger, or talked about the messenger, before I forget, Muhammad. And now, got rid of that old mask because it was dirty and I forgot to get a new one. So I'll have to use this one. And now we're going to talk about his message, the Quran. And throughout this, I'm playing for you one of the readings we had. I forget which surah it is. I forget the number, but the name is of Mary, Maryam, because Mary, the mother of Jesus, is mentioned somewhere in the surah. It's a long surah, but she's mentioned, and so she gets the title of that chapter. So I thought I'd play it. I'll make it a little bit lower. This is typically how the Quran should be experienced. It's not really read as a book, but it is sung, as I've mentioned in a lot of religions. Mentioned in that in Hinduism, the Vedas were taught by the guru, the teacher, singing to the students. That's how they would memorize. Some of you may have gone to a synagogue or experienced it online, and you might have noticed that the Torah was not just read, the reading from the Torah was sung. And if I could give you an example from Christianity, but if you went to like an Eastern Orthodox or Eastern Christian church, liturgy is also always sung. The Gospels are always sung. Kind of supposed to be sung in Western Roman Catholic churches, but they almost never do it. Don't know why. You'd have to ask the priests and bishops why they choose not to do it. But it's certainly supposed to be done. The gospel should be sung to the people. So you have this idea in a lot of religions of singing the scriptures, singing the revelation in order to learn it and interiorize it. The revelation for Islam is the Quran. Oh, this is killing me. Now I know I did. I can't see. The Quran. And there you have a definition of the Quran. Just to remind you that, I don't think I put this PowerPoint on Google Apps yet, but I will. I'll put it on Google Drive as soon as I get a chance. The Quran, also spelled traditionally Koran or Quran. Either one is fine. And the word Quran comes from the Arabic qara'ah. Qara'ah, which means to recite. Just like if we think about the first surah, we learned Surah 96, which scholars believe is the first part of the Quran to have been received by Muhammad. Qara, Gabriel, the Archangel Gabriel or Jibril tells Muhammad to recite. He commands him to recite. So the Quran is, Qara'a means to recite or to read something. But it also has the extended meaning of explaining or studying. It has that extended meaning. But I would say the essential meaning is to recite or to read. Hence, the common translation of Quran is recitation. It is the recitation. And what is it? Basically, you see there in the definition, it's a book which contains a series of divine revelations which were given to our friend, our buddy, Muhammad ibn Abdullah. He started receiving them on the Night of Power, as we know, in 610 AD, the Night of Power, 610 AD, and he received these revelations all the way until 632, shortly before his death. Okay? and these revelations were collected and they become the book that we now know as and call the Quran. Muslims believe that the Quran is the perfect revelation, is a perfect revelation made immediately by God and given directly from God. It comes directly from God. And, well, yes, I'll go to that in a moment. So it's by, not just by God, but it comes from God. And again, we've seen that kind of idea in other religions like Judaism, when we talked about the Ten Commandments. You know, God himself writes down the commandments on the stone tablets, and he gives them to Moses. Okay, so a similar idea. The Quran derives from God himself, quite actually, in Islamic belief. Okay, there's no intermediary. God is the producer of it. And the written Quran, the Quran that we have, the written Quran, the book, is a mere copy of this divinely created pattern, this prototype, which exists in heaven with Allah. Okay? Remember, Muhammad is a reciter. He's not creating the revelation himself. He's not using his own words. The belief is that he is reciting from something he sees. He has visions of these words, okay? These words come from God himself. So what's written down from what Muhammad recites is simply a copy of it. There's the divine prototype, and there is the copy, which is the written Quran, which is also a perfect copy, but I'll get into that in a moment. This prototype exists in heaven with Allah. It is called the mother of the book, or in Arabic, al-Kitab. Means mother, and Kitab means book. So the mother of the book in English, which is a way of saying the source. A mother is a source of life, yes? Okay? Something comes out of her. And the same idea by analogy. This is the thing, this is the source of the written Quran. The mother of the book is, as I said, it exists in heaven, and if it's in heaven, that means, by implication, it's in the presence of God himself. It is written in Arabic, what's called now classical Arabic. So old, one might say ancient Arabic from the 7th century, Arabic as it was spoken in the 7th century AD. And interestingly enough, it just happens to be written in the dialect spoken by Muhammad's tribe, the Qurayshis. Remember in the textbook that his family tribe is called Quraysh, or the Qurayshis. I don't like having that there, but I don't know if it bothers me enough to move anything around. The Quraysh tribe in Mecca, what that Muhammad was part of, that's from the textbook. Yeah, so the Arabic is not just any old Arabic, it just happens to be the Arabic that Muhammad happened to speak. So God has a lot of foresight. Well, then he's God, you know, he knows what he's going to do in the future. So he made sure it was an Arabic form that Muhammad would understand. So it's written in Arabic, carved on this stone tablet, this big stone tablet in the presence of God, where the revelation is carved in Arabic. And there is a reference to this, actually, in the Quran itself. The Quran is self-referential. It refers to this al-Kitab in Surah 85. In Surah 85, verse 21. I want to say that, but that's not right. I give you there the quote, "Surely this is a glorious Quran, a glorious recitation, inscribed on an imperishable tablet." You could also say on an indestructible tablet, a tablet of stone that will not be destroyed, that continues forever. Why is that word inscribed? Because in Arabic, and you'll notice this if you see some of the stuff that I put up here, you get stuff in parentheses, words in parentheses, and the reason is because the Arabic can sometimes be kind of choppy. You know, it's kind of a thought. It gives you a thought form in the Arabic, and you kind of finish it off in your head. You know, you kind of know kind of know what the gist is of what the Arabic statement is. But sometimes you have to insert words to complete it for the reader. So, literally it's in Arabic, more or less. Surely this is a glorious Quran on an imperishable tablet. Okay, so the implication is it's written on the tablet in heaven. So that's a reference to the al-Kitab, at least it's accepted as the reference to this stone tablet that is in heaven. Since the Quran is believed to come from God himself, to be in his presence, and Muslim theologians still debate to this day whether the Quran was created by God, was made by him, or is eternal like God. They haven't come up with an answer to that one. You have different schools of thought. There are some that say, no, the Quran is eternal and beyond time as God is. Oh, he paused. I thought he must have taken the break for some tea. And others say, no, the Quran is made. It's a creature. It's not God. The Quran is not God. But so there's a debate. But remember that we had that same idea in Judaism, where there was the tradition among some Jews that the Torah was created by God at the beginning of creation. It's still created by God, but that it was created on, remember, the eve of the Sabbath, yes, on Friday during the 6 days of creation, and the day before God rested on Saturday. Although there are some Jews who do believe that the Torah has existed forever. The Torah itself is eternal like God. So you have that same kind of idea and debate going on in other religions. So yeah, the Quran comes from, to say that it comes from God is an understatement for Muslims. Okay, it comes from God. It's not just like any other book, and so there can't really be any true translation of the Quran. I mean, I'm using a translation from N.J. Dawood, and I use other translations throughout based on, if they kind of work in with what I'm trying to teach. Like I use the Pickthall translation, and there's the Khan translation, a whole bunch of different translations in English and other languages. But really, there's no true translation of the Quran. It must be read and studied in Arabic, because that's the language God wrote it in. And any translation is then merely an interpretation. It's only an interpretation. So if you ever become a Muslim, then you're going to have to become somewhat fluent in Arabic, fluent enough that you can read the Quran from beginning to end, and also do grammar studies so you can further delve into the intricacies of the Quran, and also understand what's going on at the mosque, because almost everything's going to be in Arabic, and not modern or the Arabic you speak. It's going to be in this classical Arabic from several centuries or many centuries ago. Portions of this revelation, let's see where I go after that. Well, I'm getting to that, so I'll stay here. Portions of this revelation, get to the picture in a moment, were given to Muhammad, or made available to Muhammad, who merely recited what he saw. And if you did the reading from for Islam, and there were several readings from several chapters in the Quran, you might have noticed that several times it talked about the Quran was sent down to Muhammad. Okay, so it wasn't, Muhammad was not the creator of it, he was the recipient. It was sent down by God to him. Okay, so yes, I understand. Could you please put your computer away? I would appreciate that. Thank you. So that kind of gives you another idea of how Muslims view this revelation. I won't even say the book, but how they review this revelation. It's made available to Muhammad. And the resulting we could say the earthly Quran, the supernatural Quran written on the stone, and then this earthly Quran, it's sent down to Muhammad, and now you have the earthly written Quran, is believed to be the faithful, exact reproduction of this eternal, divinely composed version that's in heaven with God. So that's what you have. This goes on forever, so All right, my friend, keep on reciting. God bless. It is then not just, the Quran is not just, not only the sacred book of Islam, but for Muslims, it is the sacred book. It is the sacred book of all ages, of all times. Nothing is comparable to it. It is eternal. And I say eternal because, as I just told you, there is debate about whether it is eternal like God, but it is everlasting in the sense that it is never going to be destroyed. It is never going to go away. So it is eternal. It is, for some Muslims, uncreated, or certainly created by God as the beginning of all things, of all his creation. And it is perfect. It is perfect. So for some Muslims, I mean, the Quran, and maybe it's safe to say for many Muslims, the Quran has the attributes of God himself, even though it is, you might say, well, it's a book, but it's more than a book. It is incomparable. Nothing compares to it. And as what it is, this revelation of God coming from God himself, it is the essential basis for Muslim belief and practice, what they believe about God and the world, and how they act towards the world. Okay? That's why it might be people might, from other religious traditions, might not understand how to interact or deal with Muslims because they're coming from a completely different worldview. I mean, it's not enough to say to someone, like people will talk about the Bible and they'll say, well, but the Bible was written so many centuries, thousands of, over 2,000 years ago, it was finally written down, or 2,500 years ago. And it represents stories from a culture that's thousands of years ago, a different culture, a Middle Eastern culture, much like Islam. And some of the things, that are there, say about women, or about, say, gay rights or something, some modern issues, they don't apply anymore. They applied for them in their culture, not saying whether it was right or wrong, but they had their views. But now they're different and they have to change. Well, how do you change it? If you have it written, carved into an actual stone, and by God in his presence, it's, you can see how even someone you might think is more of a liberal-minded Muslim, or something, whatever that means, you're gonna, there's a different idea here about what the revelation is. It doesn't change. It can't change so easily. It's not as easy as people might think, because we're thinking, maybe I'm thinking as a Christian from a Western Christian perspective, with the Enlightenment, the experience of the Enlightenment and stuff like that, and biblical studies and archaeology, and that doesn't happen with the Quran, as you probably should know. I would hope you should know from that article we read from the New York Times about different, which was a weird title for the article. It says, scholars are quietly giving their theories about the Quran. And the article, I mean, it's the New York Times. Every newspaper and media outlet has its own axe to grind and thing they want to, hobby horse they want to ride on their own views. And this article is no different. But, it was talking and made the point that, the way people might study the Bible, for example, if this were a Bible course or something, we'd be talking about history and archaeology. We'd be talking about the language of the Bible, cultural studies, sociology. That doesn't happen very much with the Quran because it doesn't matter. God doesn't need to know sociology. He didn't need, God's not an anthropologist. He's not a psychologist. It's the al-Kitab. It's there, perfectly written forever, from all time, apparently, and forever. It does not change. We change, but it doesn't change. So if we had, I don't think we have any Muslims. I've had Muslim students before, but I don't think we have any in this class. Some of the things I would say, will be saying in a few moments, will sound very strange. And it's not meant to distress anybody or cause anyone angst or concern, but just to tell you, this is where I'm coming from. I'm coming from a different perspective than a believing Muslim would come from. So a Quran, the book, even though a written copy of the Quran is not the al-Kitab, it still contains the revelation from the al-Kitab, and so needs to be venerated accordingly. So a Quran should only be touched with your right hand. The the left hand is used for cleaning yourself. And I'll just leave it at that. But okay, so, and you know, maybe you know this in a lot of, you know, say Middle Eastern cultures, but not just the Middle East. You might find this in other cultures throughout the world where it's the custom to eat with your right hand. Okay, if you ever go to, like, say, a Moroccan restaurant or an Ethiopian restaurant, you know, people typically will sit, if it's traditional, will like sit down and you'll serve yourself usually with your right hand. You don't touch things with your left hand because that's considered bad because you've used it to clean yourself. The same thing in Islam. You don't touch the Quran with your right, or excuse me, with your left hand, which could be dirty. You want it with your right hand. And before you even read the Quran, before you even crack the book open, you should wash your hands and maybe wash other parts of your body as a ceremonial cleansing. You should never place the Quran under any book. You know, so here's the Bible. And, you know, I kind of think about this. You know, Islam has changed me in a certain way. And I try to be respectful of the Bible. I don't just, you know, stuff it under other books or, you know, put it under the creaky leg of a table, you know. Stick it there. Hey, it's just the right thickness. No, you know, if this were a Quran, no, you never place it under other books. It's always placed on top. It should always be on top. And if it's in your home, it should be placed in an elevated position in the home. So sometimes if you went into a Muslim's home, you might find a copy of the Quran on the wall somewhere in the highest position, you know, over everything else, for that symbolism that it is above everything. Right? Hopefully the cat doesn't jump up there, you know, because you know how cats like to climb. Anyways, that's, you know, cats have no fear of God or man. You know what I'm saying? Anyways. So yeah, if the Quran is being read, as I just had for a few moments, someone reciting a surah of the Quran, typically you would not talk during that out of respect for the Quran. You keep silence when the Quran is read. And a book of the Quran will sometimes, not always, but be wrapped in silk or ornate precious cloth. Many Muslims will memorize the whole Quran. I mean, that's a certain feat. They will memorize it from beginning to end. And in the early history of Islam, apparently that's what people did to remember it, because not all of it was written down yet. So people were reciters themselves. They would memorize the revelations that came from Muhammad. And people still do that. They will memorize the whole book in Arabic, of course. And there are different styles of reciting. There are different, you could call it different ways of reciting. And I think there are doing my research, there are something like 7 schools of recitation, different ways to kind of pronounce the words or the vowels, different intonations that a person can give. And so there are 6 orthodox schools or correct way of doing this, and you could learn one of them if you wanted to be one of these people. Now I'll get to this picture. I've showed you this before. This comes from the University of Birmingham, the United Kingdom. And this is a page from some leaves of a manuscript which were identified as the Quran. They carbon dated them, and the dates came in between 568 to 645. So, you know, the paper is pre-Muhammad, before his birth, but probably, you know, obviously you don't have the Quran necessarily, I would think, before Muhammad. So this is probably the earliest copy of the Quran. It's not the whole Quran, but the earliest evidence for the Quran that we have. But in doing my research, they had other early copies as well. There's a copy in Yemen, in the country of Yemen, in a mosque there. They discovered one, which is almost as early as this one, but it's not. This is earlier. This is dated earlier. Country of, down here, there are a few countries. There's the country of Oman. There's the country of Yemen, which is here like this. Qatar, Bahrain, okay. And then Saudi Arabia there. This is where the country of Yemen is. And in Yemen, within the last 10 years, I want to say 2015, but anyway, within the last 10 years, they found a copy, an old copy, which at the time was believed to be the oldest, until they found this copy in the University of Birmingham's library. And they're not the only ones, because I found there's in Tübingen in Germany, they found an old one that they had since like the 1800s just lying around, and they finally got it tested, and someone noticed that it was like really old, and maybe we should test this. And they all come from around this period. They all come from, around the time of Uthman, So even though this Quran is said to be the earliest, it might go, some would say maybe it goes back to Muhammad or shortly thereafter. Well, not everyone seems to agree. Some people say that the text that's represented on the paper is certainly old, that it's written on, but the text might be from the time of Uthman because it represents the kind of text that is associated with the Quran that Uthman created, remember? And Uthman was, what was he, 644? Something, anyway, when he died, something like that. Anyway, if memory serves. Nevertheless, so there in the last 10 years, at least certainly since that New York Times article, remember the New York Times article was written in 2002, and at the time, the earliest evidence, according to the article, were Quranic inscriptions that were written on the wall of the dome of the Rock Mosque. There's a mosque that's built in Jerusalem in the spot where the old Jewish temple used to be. They built a mosque there because they wanted a place to pray. Jerusalem's a holy city for Muslims. And on the walls of this mosque, the Dome of the Rock Mosque, they wrote stuff from the Quran. And so that's our earliest evidence of actual quotations from the Quran, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, according to the New York Times article. But now we know, since the New York Times article, that is wrong. They've been finding all sorts of manuscripts that are older than when the Dome of the Rock was constructed. So if I were to, like, for example, ask you on a quiz, if you read the article, why is that wrong now? This is what the New York Times says. The Dome of the Rock apparently was built in 691 AD. Well, now we have this, which at least is from 645 AD. So that's 40 some years earlier than the Dome of the Rock building. Okay? So the inscriptions on the walls of the Dome of the Rock were our first concrete evidence that the Quran actually existed. Of course, it existed before because Muslims. There were Muslims, reciting it and apparently reading it. But it was our first concrete evidence. But now we have all sorts of manuscripts since 2002 that have been discovered since that article, especially this one, showing that, no, we have earlier evidence for the existence of the Quran, almost going back to the time of Muhammad himself. How did the Quran, oh, that's what it was. How did the Quran come about? Well, there are two views. There's a traditional view, which if you go to a mosque, this is basically the story you'll hear. And then there's the scholarly view, which, diverges in some details from the traditional view. Because with the traditional view, with religion, you're dealing with people's beliefs and their theology. And so, so some things have to be because they fit into the theology and the belief system, but they might not actually be historically accurate. Nevertheless, according to the traditional view, Muhammad starts receiving the visions and he starts reciting what he's seeing, yes? He starts preaching on these visions. And from the traditional view, Muhammad's recitations were almost immediately written down and gathered together. In fact, there are some stories that people, that probably doesn't seem practicable. But anyways, there are some stories that Muhammad even had like scribes walking around with him, just ready, waiting. Is it coming, Muhammad? You got something? Yeah. No, we're just a bad piece of shit. You know what I'm saying? But but that's some of the stories that they were walking around, and as soon as Muhammad went into a trance and started reciting, they had these scribes and just start writing stuff down. Okay, probably not. No one can be with anyone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 360 some days a year. And sometimes people like to think that about Christianity, like with the Gospels, that the apostles were there, and as soon as Jesus said something interesting, Matthew was writing it down for his gospel, and it probably wasn't working like that. But this is the traditional view. The revelations that Muhammad was given were written down and gathered together almost immediately. In fact, once a year, the belief is, the story goes, Muhammad and Jibril, the archangel Gabriel, would have a meeting. Gabriel would come back down from heaven. They'd have a confabulation. They would hold a meeting once a year where Muhammad and Gabriel would go over the revelations that he had received for the year, and they would collect them together and organize them. And during the last year of Muhammad's life, I guess Gabriel kind of knew, maybe because he's an angel, that Muhammad was on his last legs and was about to die. So Gabriel was like, hey, why don't we meet twice this year? And just go over the stuff, look over the stuff, collect it, gather it. So by Muhammad's death, the oracles that he had received, the revelations, were mostly already gathered and put into order, according to the traditional view. And so this collection was received by our friend Abu Bakr, the first Rashidun, first upright caliph. And Abu Bakr kept this collection, and when Abu Bakr died, this was passed on to Umar, the next caliph. And Umar passed it on, actually, not to the next caliph, which was Uthman, but passed it on to his daughter, Hafsa. So the progression, according to the traditional story, the progression goes like this. You have Muhammad, and I said I was going to write it down using the traditional spelling. Muhammad to Abu Bakr, Abu Bakr to, let's say, Umar, and Umar gives it to his daughter, Hafsa. Who is also one of the wives of Muhammad. She had been one of his several wives. So you see the story. You have already the written collection of oracles that have been kind of organized. They haven't been necessarily put into book form yet, but the collection is being passed on from one to the other to the other. So you see a chain of transmission. And then finally, when we come to Uthman, remember Uthman wants to standardize the Quranic text because there are variations, there are differences that bother him. People are starting to kind of remember, and in Uthman's mind, kind of misremember the revelation. He wants a standard text. He gets the collection from Hafsa, and that becomes the basis for Uthman's edition. So now we come to our buddy Uthman. If you, as you remember from the story, Uthman goes about having all the other collections of writings of Muhammad's revelations destroyed. Although clearly he missed some have, nothing's ever 100%, stuff survives. And we do seem to have stuff that may be from Uthman, although as I said, there is some debate that the text is still Uthmanic, as they say. But it seems like in the case of this, it does come before Uthman. Anyways, so all the other collections are just destroyed. And so now the recitation, this verbal, oral transmission becomes now the book, al-kitab, the book, the writing, which is all kitab means in Arabic. Kitab means to write, means the same in Hebrew. Khatab, related language. So now you have the book, Al-Kitab. So Al-Quran becomes Al-Kitab. It's both. Al-Kitab is the record of the recitation. And from this Kitab, Al-Kitab, all copies of the Quran come. All copies of modern Arabic copies that we have been transmitted from this Uthmanic, this copy that was standardized by the Caliph Uthman back in the 7th century. Is it 644? Uthman died in 644, yes? Someone do me a solid and refresh my memory. I might have something for you. So according to the Oxford Dictionary of World Religions, quote, thus within some 30 years of Muhammad's death, a definitive text was established, which has remained virtually unchanged down to present day. Okay, and that's pretty much true. The stuff that I've read from people who are scholars in the Quran tend to agree that Uthman's standardized version has been very little changed since the 7th century when it came about. Before that is another story. Now, the scholarly view is somewhat similar, but somewhat different. Obviously, Muhammad is the generator of the Quran. He proclaims his messages orally. He preaches. Muhammad, even in the traditional view, Muhammad did not write anything down himself. Supposedly, he was illiterate. He could not read or write. That's the story. But illiterate can have an elastic meaning, just meaning he was not formally educated. He may have known somewhat to read and write. But the point is that he didn't waste his time writing stuff down. He preached his message and others wrote things down. And some of the things might have written down, but more often than not, what people did was which was a completely normal reaction in the ancient world, they memorized. They were not, God bless you, they were not writing cultures in that way. I mean, a lot of ancient cultures didn't have writing. Writing was a real development in human history. You passed it on by telling stories, and you had to learn them, so people memorized them. So when Muhammad dies, there's no complete writing per se. This idea that there's this organized group of stuff that's all orderly, it just hasn't been put into a real book form yet and written down in that way. No, probably not. There's no complete writing and this is also based on evidence, not just from in the Quran itself and what the Quran, Muhammad says about the Quran, but from what we can glean from history. So when Muhammad dies, there's no complete writing. The Quran, such as it existed, was mostly an oral recitation that was passed on by reciters. Reciters, who I mentioned before, the Qurra. These people called Qurra. They were the ones who were passing on the revelations. There were no printing presses, and people weren't copying copies of the Quran yet. The main form or the main group in the community were these people called reciters, not writers or scribes. They were reciters, people who had memorized a lot of the revelations, or in some cases, all of them. So for example, Abu Bakr, the first caliph, was honored because he had memorized all of the revelations Muhammad had received. So you had the Qurra who recall Muhammad's revelations from memory. However, and this is the problem that Uthman sees, is that the memories change, okay? And reciters in different areas where Islam is in the community and located throughout the Middle East and Africa sometimes remembered the Quranic revelation differently. And so as this recitation does get written down, and it does seem to have been written down in some places over time, you have different textual traditions that develop. And so that's why I have my map here at the end. Whoops, I don't want to do that. Huh. Oh, that's so you have, for example, Medina and Mecca, the two major cities. Damascus, this city up here. You have a couple of cities in Mesopotamia, modern day Iraq. that each had written Qurans that, because of the Qur'an tradition they had, just a little bit different, sometimes significantly different, enough that it troubled Uthman, because how could God give one, several perfect revelations? Didn't seem to make sense. There has to be one. So it's kind of a scandal in a way. And so that, and you have these differing text traditions, and we have some evidence of this in Islamic history of Muslim scholars talking about, sometimes you'll read that a Muslim scholar will be talking about the Quran and will say, well, this is what it says in the Quran, but there used to be this reading such and such, which was different. But because of theological reasons, they don't usually want to deal with that. They only use it to interpret, maybe give a further explanation of what the standard Quran says, because the standard Quran is perfect. It's written by God. So this other thing is just an explanation. They don't see it as a different version of the perfect revelation. So they kind of but they do sometimes mention this. They have, that there are sometimes different versions that other Muslims remember still. So Uthman notices this problem, and he's the one who, as we know, pushes to standardize the text. And so all copies of the Quran come back to this version. So scholars agree that basically what the Quran that's had today comes from Uthman. However, according to another quote here, a scholar Arthur Jeffrey, this man Arthur Jeffrey, that I found a book by him, who was an Australian, but he actually ended up teaching here in the United States at Columbia University. He taught Semitic languages like Arabic and Hebrew and stuff like that, and he wrote a book. And he said, there can be little doubt that the text canonized, made the standard by Uthman, was only one amongst several types of text in existence at the time. Arthur Jeffrey. And that kind of stands to reason, because if you accept the traditional view that there was like one collection already organized, even with the help of the Archangel Gabriel with Muhammad, just passed along, and finally Uthman just writes it all down finally and makes the book, and there was no problem, it was the same, then why is Uthman destroying other books of the Quran? Why is he burning them? Why is he forcing people to hand them over so that they can be burned and no one can use them anymore? Which kind of begs the question, why is he doing that? Well, because there were other versions and they contradicted texts, the official text that Uthman wanted. So what is the Quran about? Hopefully you have some idea from having read the Quran. Maybe you read the shorter surahs rather than the longer ones, but hopefully you read at least one or two of them, so you get a sense of what's in it. As I already told you, it's in classical Arabic, even the Arabic that Muhammad spoke. God was very helpful with that. And it is rhymed couplets. I don't know if it's poetry per se. I don't know if it's formalized poetry, but there certainly is rhyming. So a couplet is where you have two lines of text, okay? I went yesterday to the store because I didn't have bread anymore. Two lines, it's a couplet, and it rhymes. And it's kind of poetry. And that's what you see in the Quran, especially the earlier portions of the Quran when Muhammad starts receiving it. My stuff is out of order here. Whoopsie doodle. From what I have on the PowerPoint. Whoops. I hate this because it's a touch screen. But it is beautiful rhymed Arabic couplets, especially in the early surahs. The later surahs, the later chapters are more prosaic. Prose is just a fancy term for what we mean by when you're just talking. There's no rhythm or meter or scansion or rhyming. It's clearly not poetry. You're just talking. What I'm doing now is called prose. So there are prosaic elements and ordinary elements in the Quran, and these seem to come from the later chapters, the older chapters in the Quran. Some scholars have noted that this earlier kind of poetic style of rhymed couplets that Muhammad used were very similar to a kind of poetry that was used amongst pagan Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, where Muhammad was from. Might even actually, forget if they mentioned that in the textbook or they mentioned it in the New York Times article, or both places. But anyways, but I'm telling you that the scholars have seen there are some connections. The Quran doesn't exist in a vacuum, historically speaking. For scholars, they see it as the product of a human being, and Muhammad apparently was aware of the different kind of styles, that genres that were available to him, and he chose one of those styles from amongst his own people, the Arabs, in which to embed his message. It is 140 chapters, and the word in Arabic is a surah. That's the singular. Forget what I think surwan or suwar, I forget it's different, the plural is different in Arabic, and I don't remember it. I looked at it the other day, but I forget. But a surah is a chapter. So there are 114 chapters, and each chapter, each surah, is a composite collection of really different verses that were written at various periods of Muhammad's ministry. And it's nearly impossible to tell when different sections, even of each chapter, were given to Muhammad. Some things hang together because they're talking about the same theme or topic. And then, as you might have noticed from the readings, they'll seg right into something completely different and stuff like that. So, each surah is really a composite of various verses that may have been given at different times, probably were given at different times and put together. Each surah is organized, or the Quran is organized according from the longest to the shortest surah. So you have 114 surahs. So beginning with, we'll skip surah 1. Surah 1 is kind of like a little introductory surah. It's very short. So that's kind of the exception that proves the rule. But beginning from surah 2 until surah 114, they are all organized by length in Arabic. In Arabic. So you have the longest to the shortest. So Surah 2 would be quite long, would be the longest of the surahs, and Surah 114, as you might expect, is the shortest. Again, forgetting about Surah number 1, which is a little introductory surah. So as you're reading, one of the nice things about the Quran is as you're reading, you start reading Surah 2, 3, 4, 5, and man, these are really long. But really, as you're progressing through the surahs, they're getting shorter and shorter and shorter to the point where you get to starting around, I wouldn't say, well, anyways, when you get to the later ones, the 80s, the 90s, the 100s, obviously, it's just maybe a few verses. So they're very short indeed. The Quran was revealed piecemeal over, like 22 years of Muhammad's life. And sometimes it was, over a period of weeks or months. I mean, it wasn't necessarily every day that Muhammad received a revelation. So he received verses sometimes over periods of weeks or months. And the 114 surahs are organized according to length, yes, longest to shortest, but they're not organized according to any sort of chronology, time period, not really, although there is a little bit of an exception to that as well. Each surah is named after a theme or a topic that occurs in the surah. So I don't give them to you here on the bell. I'll just mention some here. For example, surah number 2, the first surah, the real long one, is called the cow. And probably because it mentions cows in it. And number 14 is called Abraham, meaning the Jewish ancestor Abraham. So he is mentioned in Surah 14. Surah 19, which I had this background music in a way, this guy reciting the Quran, he was reciting Surah 19, which is called Maryam, Mary, the mother of Jesus. Surah 65 is called Divorce. Surah 71 is about Noah, or has Noah mentioned in it, etc., etc., etc. I'm sure you get the idea, okay? Now, I mean, I listened to the readings too. I put them on my, because they have them recited online. I just downloaded an MP3, put it into my phone, and I'm listening to it as I'm driving back and forth. And and you have to notice that even though, for example, for Surah 19 it says Mary, which means the mother of Jesus, it's only really a very short section that talks about her. The rest of it's all over the place on all sorts of other things. So for me as an outsider, I don't know exactly why. It's maybe because she's such an important figure, okay? But Surah 2, the cow, or the other surah we read, I think it was Surah 9 or 5, called the table that is set, the set table, the prepared table. Yeah, it mentions a story about Jesus performing a miracle, having a table prepared with food coming from heaven, which is kind of late in the whole surah. Maybe because it's Jesus, that's why it's given the name. But I, personally as an outsider, I don't know why or what always the connection is between the word or theme. Nevertheless, that's how it functions. It's worked for them. God bless them. Right? Okay, I think I mentioned that, so I'll move on with that. This is the exception I mentioned before. When I said that they are not arranged chronologically, there is some chronological data attached to some of the surahs. Some of the surahs are identified as coming from Mecca, when Muhammad began his ministry in Mecca, and other surahs are identified as coming from Muhammad's time in Medina. Okay, I'm presuming that's just traditional. Okay, because there isn't necessarily any information in a particular surah that I think would identify it. But nevertheless, there are some surahs, not all the surahs, but some of the surahs you'll see at the very beginning. In the opening, it will say Mecca or Medina, and that's what's going on there. It's giving you at least a location and some kind of a chronology, because Mecca is first, and then Muhammad emigrates up to Medina. I don't know what they do after Medina, because Muhammad is still receiving revelations there after Medina, and he gets to Mecca. But anyways, because he does receive some revelations in Mecca near the end of his life, but whatever. So there are some indications of where certain surahs came from. As I said, it's sketchy. It's not clear necessarily what it's indicating. I'll mention that. We'll get to the sunnah in a minute. The surah, I'll get to that now. Okay. The Quran covers many different subjects. Okay, it is really a grab bag. It's kind of, as Muhammad received a revelation, he recited it, and the revelation could be about anything that God wanted to reveal to him. And so you see that throughout the Quran. The Quran contains stories about earlier prophets. Most of them seem to be Jewish prophets. Jesus is mentioned. Abraham, I already mentioned. Noah is mentioned. Moses. There are frequent proclamations of God's judgment. You might have noticed this in the readings from the Quran, how it talks about the day of judgment or the day that's coming. Okay, so there are frequent reminders that God's judgment is coming, not only at the end of a person's life, maybe especially at the end of a person's life, but later on, maybe at the end of the world. So, of course, there are also frequent references to hell, that people who are bad people will burn in the everlasting fire. There are sometimes laws given by Muhammad. For example, in one of the readings from the Quran that I gave you, Muhammad outlines we could say the kosher rules. They call it halal, but it's basically the same meaning as kosher, approved foods, halal. And so in one of the readings from the Quran that we had, Muhammad receives a revelation where he says, you can't eat pigs, you can't eat pig meat, you can't eat, what else does he say? Animals that have died on their own, okay? animals that have been killed, but they haven't been killed properly. The name of Allah has not been prayed over them. Animals that have been strangled or had their heads smashed in. You have to kind of cut their throat in a certain way. Which I find interesting because you go on my, you know I have my YouTube page where I have the live stream for this. And if you scroll down, you'll see I was in Papua New Guinea for about a year. And while I was there, I went to a mosque. The place I was teaching y'all. Took a little interreligious journey, and we went to the local mosque in the capital city, and I took video of it, and it's there. And there are very few Muslims in this country. It's called Papua New Guinea. It's mainly a Christian country, very Christian. So there are very few Muslims there. But there were Muslims, okay? And it was interesting to see because, you had Papua New Guineans, but you also had Europeans showing up who were there in the city for business or something. So you had this great mixture of Papua New Guineans, as you know, they look like Africans. They look like black Africans from sub-Saharan Africa. Some of them look Asian, Polynesian, which is the mixture of the peoples that happened long ago. But so you have native Papua New Guineans there, very dark-skinned, but you got white-skinned Europeans, and so it just was an interesting experience. It shows that Islam is meant to be a universal brotherhood and sisterhood, embracing everybody, one community. And it's funny because Papua New Guineans, pigs are a big part of their culture. Pigs are like money. And I mean that. Not that they are money, but they are kind of like money. In the traditional tribal societies of Papua New Guinea that still exist there, pigs were what you would use to give to people like money. So if you had a lot of pigs, you were considered a rich person. So if you did not, you were a poor person. But if you had at least one pig, man, that pig was very valued by you. Eventually, you would kill the pig and feast on it. And that's a big celebration. And to kill the pig, you have to, they would smash it in the head. They have a club, the guy comes up, the father of the family, and smashes the pig in the head and kills it. Eventually, I imagine. So when I was listening, my point is when I was listening to this discussion in the Quran by Muhammad for these Papua New Guinean Muslims, I wonder how they navigate that because they're not supposed to eat pig, but they're not also, they have the double whammy that they can't eat the pig. To kill the pig, they smash it in the head, and that's also a no-no according to halal. You're not supposed to crush the skull of the animal, which they do in their culture. And I did ask about it, and apparently was told that their legal Islamic experts have ways of working around the Arabic. Like Arabic doesn't mean the kind of pigs that we have here in Papua New Guinea. Apparently, swine or the porcine species is different. A pig is not really a pig where they live. The pigs were different in the Arabian Peninsula. Okay. So it was just interesting. So the main message, though, amongst all of these other different little messages in the Quran, which deal with all sorts of topics and issues, is God. That God is one. There is no other. He has no wife. He has no children like a son. Wink, wink. I think we know who that comment is directed at, that God does not have a son. And Muhammad has the authority of God. So you might have also noticed throughout the readings that we had how often Muhammad talks about, or I should say God talks about Muhammad and how important he is and how people need to follow him and follow his message. Which leads us to this, the Sunnah. The Sunnah. What is the Sunnah? The Sunnah in Arabic simply means custom. This is the equivalent of sacred tradition from Christianity, or sacred tradition in any religion. Every religion has, written writings that are written down, but you also have the way of life and how people live, the religious habits that are developed. And Islam is no different. You have the Sunnah, which means custom, tradition, habit, a way of doing things. But Sunnah is different for Muslims. Sunnah is kind of like sacred tradition for Christianity, but even more so, because Sunnah is in some ways almost as binding as the revelation in the Quran. Almost as binding. And in fact, the way Muslims, you could say that the way Muslims actually live their daily lives is more governed by the Sunnah than anything in the Quran. I mean, the Quran, if you read the Quran, you're going to look in vain for any kind of outline of Muslim life. It's really the Sunnah, where it's from the Sunnah that people get their instructions on how to live. So what is the Sunnah? The Sunnat al-Nabi, the custom of the Prophet. That's basically what it comes from, this phrase, Sunnat al-Nabi, the custom of the Prophet. How did the Prophet live the message? Just like in Christianity, people ask, well, how did the apostles live their experience with Jesus? They knew him. They saw him. They heard him, apparently. So how did they live that experience? Sacred traditions. It's kind of the same idea. Sunnat al-Nabi. How did the prophet live this message? And so you have your definition there. These are all the ways, which could be words, statements by Muhammad, things that he did, or things that he did not do, the silent approval, things that he didn't comment on, which gave in kind of a nod and a wink that, yes, that's okay to do, or no, you shouldn't do that. Like, should Muslim men have to wear beards? Maybe Muhammad didn't say anything about it, but he did wear a beard and he never shaved it off. That could be a sign of his silent approval of the practice. Muhammad himself mentions this in the Quran, in Quran chapter or Surah 33, where there's this statement, truly, verily, in the messenger of Allah, you have a good example. For whom, you might ask? Well, for anyone who looks unto Allah and the last day and remembers Allah much. Okay, so those who want to be faithful followers of Islam, they look unto, they submitted to God, and they're cognizant of they know that there's going to be a final judgment at the end of their life for on all the good or bad that they've done. And they remember God. Okay, if you're that kind of person, then you are going to look to Muhammad for how you are to live your life as a Muslim. So the Sunnah contains the record of how Muhammad and his companions, those related to him, especially his close friends and companions, lived. What did they do? What did they say? What were they silent about? I already mentioned. And so it's a living commentary on the authoritative foundation which is given by the Quran. Okay? Just like with the Gospels in Christianity, the sacred tradition is based on sacred scripture, and tradition is really the lived experience or the lived commentary on the Gospels for Christians, the ministry of Jesus. So the Sunnah is just as fundamentally important for Muslim life, although the Quran obviously is the most important because it comes from God himself. Can I do that? Oh, actually, I want to, that's out of order. Go to this first. The Sunnah is comprised of narratives, stories, short stories. Some are longish, but most of them are quite short, called hadith, which means the story, a narrative, something told about Muhammad. And a hadith is a traditional account from an authoritative source about some word or action of Muhammad. And yeah, I know I screwed up on spelling Islamic. I changed it in the PowerPoint though. I did change it in the PowerPoint, so why is it not changed here? I guess I forgot to save it. I did save it and then I transferred it over, but whatever. The hadith are very binding for Islamic life, for belief and practice, what Muslims are supposed to believe and do. Now, not all that glitters is gold in hadith. Okay, you have to discern, you have to study. Some hadith come from very authoritative sources, like one of the wives of Muhammad, or someone close to him in his family, like Ali. Someone like Ali would be a major source. or one of like Aisha, one of Muhammad's wives. So you have to look at it, but then you also have to look at the transmission. Does it come directly from this person, or is there a chain of transmission where it's second hand, third hand, fourth hand, and that kind of weakens the authority of the hadith? You can kind of take it or leave it sometimes. This chain of transmission in Arabic is called isnad, which comes from the Arabic word sanada, which means to lean upon or to prop something up. So that's the chain of transmission. It props up the authority of the hadith. It makes it a better hadith based on who's giving it, or it can also make it a lesser hadith if the isnad is not it's authoritative, but it's not as authoritative, or it's maybe secondhand knowledge or third-hand knowledge. It's further away from something the Prophet actually said. This will be my last point. I'll finish up on hadith. I have some examples. I'll finish that up on Thursday. Well, I'm not done. I have one last point, which is important. It'll show up on a quiz. That a hadith, so the hadith consists basically of three things. It consists of the text itself, which is the statement by Muhammad of what he thought someone should do or not do, or of his own silent approval. But then the source of the text, the person it's coming from, who should be, if it's going to be binding, it would have to be someone very authoritative, someone very close to Muhammad. So the text, let's say the authority of the person involved. And then finally, there's the transmission. Is it coming first hand, second hand, to a number of people or one person? And I'll talk more about that on Thursday. So I'll see you then. God bless you all. There's still chocolate up here. No one takes it, I'll just give it to my mom. An old woman, she'll enjoy it very much. Tinfoil wrap is done. Man. I got these small fingers, so going all over the place.
Have a good evening.
You too. Thank you, Miss. Well, I talked a little bit too much about some other things. So I'll just have to finish it on Thursday. And hopefully I can finish it now, today, with next class. Hello, Miss. 0401. Okay. I know I changed that. Okay.